The sun had not yet risen when Sir Alistair de Mirabel stood on the crest of the hill, the wind pulling at his cloak, his armor cold against his skin. Below him, the lands of King Edric stretched wide and far, rolling hills, rivers that glistened under the pale moonlight, and beyond them, the vast forests that bordered the kingdom. This was a realm he had sworn to protect with his life, a vow made on bent knee before the king himself. Alistair was the king's most trusted knight, a man whose loyalty was as unbreakable as the steel of his sword. Yet, on this morning, as dawn painted the sky with soft hues of gold and purple, his heart was not filled with the certainty he once knew. A shadow lingered, a weight he could not shake. For in the village below, nestled in the valley, lived a woman, a healer, a curandera as they called her, whose face had haunted his dreams for the last 2 years. She was no ordinary villager. Elira had saved him once, pulled him back from the edge of death with hands that knew the ancient arts of healing. Her touch had been gentle, her words full of strength, and in the dark nights that followed his recovery, something had awakened within him, something dangerous, something that defied the life he had chosen. Alistair's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, the familiar weight grounding him to the present. He was a knight, bound by duty, bound to his king. His heart, however, had grown rebellious, its loyalty split between the crown and the woman who had become his reason for living. As much as he tried to bury it, the thought of Elira was never far. But Elira had been branded by whispers, rumors that spread through the court like wildfire. They called her a witch, accused her of practicing dark magic, though Alistair knew the truth of her kindness, her selflessness. It was not magic, but knowledge that allowed her to heal. Still, the whispers grew louder each day, reaching the king's ears. Alistair had dismissed the rumors at first, but now, standing alone under the breaking dawn, the burden was heavier than ever. Only days before, King Edric had summoned him to the royal hall. Alistair, the king had said, his voice filled with the gravity that came before war. You have served me well, but I fear there is a threat within our borders. A woman who weaves spells under the guise of healing. This cannot go unchecked. She must be brought to justice. Alistair had bowed his head, his heart sinking. He knew whom the king referred to. Elira, the woman who had saved him, the woman he could not forget. And now, his king demanded her life. You will lead the charge, the king continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Find her, and ensure that she faces the fate she deserves. She is a danger to this kingdom, to all we have built. Alistair had nodded, his throat tight with the words he could not say. How could he betray her? How could he betray his king? In the days since, he had wrestled with the command, torn between his loyalty to the crown and his love for the woman who had stolen his heart. He knew what would happen if he refused. His honor, his standing as a knight, would be forfeit. Worse still, the king would send another to do what he could not, and that person would not hesitate to take Elira's life. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the earth below. Alistair closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, grounding himself. He had to make a choice, and the weight of it was suffocating. His mind turned to Elira once more. The last time he had seen her, she had been tending to a child, her hands moving with the precision of a master healer, her face calm, serene. She had looked up at him then, their eyes locking for a moment that had felt like eternity. There had been no need for words. She had known. She had always known. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence around him. Sir Alistair, came the call, soft yet commanding. Alistair turned, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his sword. It was Sir Gareth, a younger knight, though seasoned in battle. His expression was troubled. The king awaits you, my lord, Gareth said, his tone respectful, yet filled with an urgency that Alistair could not ignore. Alistair nodded. I will come. As Gareth rode back toward the castle, Alistair lingered a moment longer, his eyes drifting toward the village once more. His heart ached. He had no choice but to go, to confront the king's command. But as he turned his steed toward the castle, he knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead would force him to choose, between his vow of loyalty and the love that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. And so, with the sun rising at his back, Alistair rode toward his fate, his heart torn, and the weight of destiny pressing down on his shoulders. The dawn of his greatest battle was approaching, but it was not one fought with swords. It was a battle of the soul, where love and duty clashed like steel on steel. The great hall of Castle Edric was filled with an eerie quiet as Alistair walked its length, the stone walls echoing the sound of his boots on the cold floor. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting long shadows that danced like spirits of old battles. At the far end of the hall, beneath the towering banner of the kingdom, a lion rampant on a field of red, sat King Edric himself. The king's presence was commanding, even in stillness, and his sharp eyes tracked Alistair's approach like a hawk watching its prey. Though Alistair had known the king for many years, served him loyally through wars and countless skirmishes, today felt different. There was an edge to the air, a tension that coiled around him as he neared the throne. King Edric was not a man to tolerate disobedience, and Alistair had no illusions about what would happen if he refused the command that weighed so heavily on his heart. The hall was empty, save for a few guards standing at attention near the entrance. Even the king's advisors, who were normally present during these discussions, had been dismissed. This was a private matter, one that concerned only Alistair, the king, and the shadow of a woman whose fate now hung in the balance. "Alistair," King Edric called, his voice deep and unwavering. "Come closer." Alistair stepped forward, lowering to one knee before his king. The coolness of the stones seeped through his armor, grounding him in the moment. He kept his head bowed, knowing that to meet the king's gaze too early would be a sign of disrespect. "You are my most trusted knight," the king began, his tone calm but laden with unspoken expectations. "There is no one in this kingdom whose loyalty I hold in higher regard. Which is why I have chosen you for this task." Alistair remained still, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew the king's words were not a compliment, they were a chain, binding him to a duty he did not want. "I know you have heard the rumors about the healer," Edric continued, his voice hardening. "She is dangerous, Alistair. She uses her gifts to manipulate the weak, to gain power in ways we do not fully understand. Magic, they call it. Sorcery." Alistair clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to keep his emotions in check. He wanted to speak, to defend Elira, but he could not. "Not yet. Your silence troubles me," the king said, his eyes narrowing as he observed his knight. "Do you question my judgment?" Alistair's jaw tightened. "No, your majesty. I do not question your wisdom. Then you understand the importance of this task. We cannot allow such a threat to linger within our borders." The king leaned forward in his throne, his gaze piercing. "She must be dealt with?" The words felt like a sword cutting through Alistair's soul. Dealt with. The phrase was a death sentence, veiled in royal language. His mind raced, searching for a way to delay the inevitable, to protect the woman he loved without betraying his king. But he knew he was trapped. His duty was clear, and there was no room for hesitation. "She is in the village of Norhaven," King Edric continued, as if the matter was already settled. "I want her brought to me, alive if possible. If she resists, you know what must be done." Alistair felt the weight of the king's command settle on him like a shroud. He could not disobey. Not openly. But there had to be a way, a path that would allow him to protect Elira without forsaking his honor. He would need to tread carefully, every word, every action calculated to ensure the safety of both the kingdom and the woman who held his heart. "I will see it done," Alistair said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. The king nodded, satisfied with the response. "Good. You leave at dawn. Take only a small company, enough to secure the village, but not so many as to draw unnecessary attention. I want this dealt with swiftly and quietly." "As you command, your majesty." For a moment, the king's expression softened. "I know this is difficult for you, Alistair. I do not make such demands lightly. But you must understand, this is not just about one woman. It is about the kingdom, the safety of all my subjects." Alistair nodded, though the words did little to ease his conscience. He knew the king believed in his cause, believed that rooting out any hint of sorcery was necessary to protect his reign. But Alistair could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Elira was not the enemy they made her out to be. "Go now," King Edric said, his tone final. "Prepare your men. By this time tomorrow, the threat will be no more." Alistair rose to his feet, bowing once more before turning to leave. As he walked the length of the hall back toward the doors, the weight of the king's command pressed down on him like never before. Each step felt heavier than the last, the echoes of his boots on stone like the tolling of a bell, signaling the end of something sacred. Outside the great hall, the air was cool and sharp, the wind biting against his skin. Alistair mounted his horse, his mind already racing with thoughts of what was to come. He would leave for Norhaven at dawn, as the king had ordered. But he would not simply follow the command blindly. He would find a way to protect Alira. He had to. His heart could not bear the thought of her falling into the king's hands, condemned by lies and fear. As he rode back toward the barracks, where his men awaited him, Alistair's resolve hardened. He would face the king's wrath if he had to. But he would not lose Alira. Not like this. The dawn came slowly, a pale light creeping over the horizon as Alistair and his small company of knights made their way down the narrow, winding road that led to Norhaven. The early morning fog clung to the earth, thick and unyielding, as if the land itself sought to hide from what was to come. The clatter of hooves on the cobbled road was muffled, the world around them still and silent save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Alistair rode at the head of the group, his thoughts far from the men at his back. His heart was a battlefield, torn between the duty that had governed his life for so many years and the love he had tried to deny. Alira. Her name echoed in his mind like a prayer and a curse. He had seen her so few times in the years since she had saved him, and yet those moments had changed everything. She had become his secret, his weakness. And now, she was in danger because of him. Beside him, Gareth rode in silence. The younger knight had always looked up to Alistair, admired his skill and unwavering loyalty to the crown. But Gareth knew nothing of the struggle that raged inside his commander. To him, this was just another mission, another threat to the kingdom that had to be neutralized. He could not know that for Alistair, this was not merely about duty. It was about love, about saving a life that meant more to him than any oath he had ever sworn. "We should reach Norhaven by midday," Gareth said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, steady, as though they were riding to a routine skirmish. Alistair nodded but said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, the village still hidden in the mists. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the knot of anxiety tightening with each passing mile. What would he do when they arrived? How could he protect Alira from the fate that awaited her without betraying his king? "You've been quiet," Gareth remarked, his tone curious. "Is something troubling you?" Alistair forced a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just thinking about the task ahead." Gareth glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "I've never seen you hesitate before, Alistair. You're the strongest knight in the realm. Whatever lies ahead, we'll handle it. We always do." Alistair appreciated the younger man's confidence, but it did little to ease the weight on his heart. Gareth did not understand. He couldn't. Alistair had always been able to mask his doubts behind the armor of his duty, but now that armor felt brittle, ready to shatter at the first sign of real conflict. "I hope you're right," Alistair said quietly. They rode on, the silence between them growing once more. The road twisted through the dense forest, the trees towering above them like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Alistair's mind wandered, drifting back to the day he had met Alira. He had been wounded, his body broken in a battle that should have taken his life. But Alira had found him, her hands steady as she worked to save him, her voice soft but firm as she guided him back from the edge of death. He remembered the way her eyes had met his, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She had been fearless, even in the face of his wounds. And later, when he had recovered, he had gone to her again, not because he needed healing, but because he needed to see her, to hear her voice. It had been a foolish thing, and he had known it even then. A knight did not seek out a village healer unless he had cause. But Alistair had found cause enough in the way his heart beat faster when she was near. As the forest began to thin, revealing the distant rooftops of Norhaven, Alistair's chest tightened. They were close now. Too close. He had no plan, no idea how to protect her without defying the king. All he knew was that he could not let her die. Not like this, not for a crime she had never committed. "Alistair," Gareth said, his voice cutting through his thoughts. "What exactly are we dealing with here? Is this woman truly as dangerous as they say?" Alistair hesitated, his gaze drifting to the young knight at his side. Gareth's eyes were wide with curiosity, but there was also a glimmer of unease. The stories about Elira had spread quickly through the kingdom, growing more grotesque with each telling. She was a sorceress, a witch who used her powers to control the minds of men, to summon storms and curses with a flick of her hand. But Alistair knew the truth. Elira was no sorceress. She was a healer, nothing more. The only magic she wielded was the knowledge passed down to her from generations of women who had come before. "She's not what they say," Alistair finally replied, his voice low. "She's a healer. That's all." Gareth frowned. "Then why the urgency? Why does the king want her brought in if she's no threat?" "Because the court loves its rumors," Alistair said bitterly. "And when fear takes hold, it's easy to mistake kindness for danger." Gareth fell silent, his brow furrowed in thought. He respected Alistair too much to argue, but it was clear he was struggling to reconcile the man he trusted with the mission they had been given. Alistair couldn't blame him. It was a struggle he himself had yet to resolve. They crested a small hill, and Norhaven came into view. It was a small village, its houses clustered together like birds seeking warmth. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and in the distance, the fields stretched out toward the horizon. To any outsider, it would seem like a peaceful place, untouched by the fear that gripped the kingdom. But Alistair knew better. Fear had a way of seeping into even the quietest of places, and soon, Norhaven would become a battleground of its own. "Keep the men here," Alistair said, pulling his horse to a stop. "I'll go ahead alone." Gareth's eyes widened. "Alone? Are you sure that's wise?" Alistair nodded, his expression grim. "I need to speak with her. I need to know what we're dealing with before we make any moves." Gareth hesitated but nodded. "We'll wait here. But if you're not back by sunset, I'm coming after you." Alistair offered him a tight smile. "I'll be back." With that, he turned his horse and rode toward the village, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his chance, his one opportunity to save her. But he knew that once he crossed into Norhaven, there would be no turning back. His loyalty to the crown, his honor as a knight, would be tested in ways he had never imagined. And somewhere in the heart of that village, the woman he loved was waiting, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them both. The path to Elira's cottage was familiar, yet with every step Alistair took toward it, his heart grew heavier. The village of Norhaven lay quiet around him, its narrow streets still, the morning mist curling around the thatched rooftops like a veil. Here, in the silence, it was easy to imagine that nothing was wrong, that he was just another traveler passing through, seeking the healer's aid. But the truth lingered in the air like a storm on the horizon. He was not here as a friend. He was here as the king's knight. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, nestled against the line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. It was a modest dwelling, built of stone and wood, with a small garden outside where Elira grew her herbs. Alistair dismounted his horse and paused at the gate, his hand resting on the rough wood. He had come to this place before, wounded and broken, seeking Elira's help. Now, he came with the weight of betrayal on his shoulders. He took a deep breath and pushed open the gate, the creak of the wood cutting through the stillness. His heart raced as he approached the door, each step bringing him closer to the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his world. Alistair raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could meet the wood, the door swung open. Elira stood before him. Her appearance was as he remembered, her dark hair loosely braided, her eyes a deep, piercing blue, the color of the sky before a storm. She wore a simple gown, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hands stained with the earth from the garden. There was no fear in her expression, no surprise. It was as though she had been expecting him. "Alistair," she said softly, her voice carrying the calm strength that had always drawn him to her. For a moment, he could not speak. He had rehearsed his words on the way here, imagined how he might explain the terrible choice that lay before him. But now, standing before her, all of that vanished. His heart twisted painfully in his chest, and he cursed the weight of the king's command, the impossible decision that threatened to tear his life apart. "Alira," he said at last, his voice rough with emotion. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter the small cottage. The air inside was warm, filled with the familiar scent of herbs drying by the fire. It was a place of healing, of peace, yet Alistair felt anything but peaceful. He could feel the tension coiling tighter with each passing second, the inevitable moment of truth drawing closer. "I knew you would come," Alira said, closing the door behind him. Alistair turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "You knew?" Alira smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "The king has sent you, hasn't he?" He felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of her words like a stone in his chest. "How could you know that?" She moved to the hearth, her hands busying themselves with the fire as if to distract herself from the conversation. "The rumors have reached even this far. The whispers of witchcraft, of dark magic. I knew it was only a matter of time before the king acted." Alistair crossed the room, his voice low and urgent. "You're not what they say you are. You're a healer, Alira. They don't understand." She met his gaze then, her eyes soft but resolute. "It doesn't matter what I am, Alistair. What matters is what they believe. The king fears what he cannot control, and in his eyes, anyone who stands outside his realm of understanding is a threat." Alistair's fists clenched at his sides, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "I won't let them harm you." Alira shook her head, her expression sad but not surprised. "You cannot stop what's coming. Not you, then someone else. You know that." His heart pounded in his chest, every fiber of his being screaming in protest. He had come here to protect her, to find a way to save her from the king's wrath, but now, faced with the calm acceptance in her eyes, he realized just how helpless he truly was. No matter how skilled he was with a sword, no matter how loyal he had been to the crown, he could not fight the weight of fear and superstition that had already condemned her. "Alira." His voice broke, the words faltering on his lips. "There must be a way." She stepped toward him then, her hand gently brushing his arm, her touch warm and steady. "There is no escaping this, Alistair. But you do not have to carry this burden alone." Her words cut through him like a blade. She knew. She had always known the conflict that raged within him, the war between his duty and his heart. And now, she stood before him, ready to face whatever fate awaited her, while he stood powerless to stop it. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alira's hand slid down to his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "You have already done more than you know. You came to warn me, and for that I am grateful." Alistair looked down at their joined hands, the weight of her words sinking in. He had come to warn her, yes, but that was not enough. It would never be enough. He needed to do more, to be more. His loyalty to the crown could not outweigh the love he felt for her, and the thought of losing her, of watching her be dragged before the king to face a sentence she did not deserve, was unbearable. "There must be somewhere you can go," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "Somewhere they won't find you." Alira shook her head again, gently squeezing his hand. "I cannot run, Alistair. My place is here. This is my home." The truth of her words struck him like a blow. She was not a coward, not someone who would flee at the first sign of danger. Alira had always been stronger than him in that way. She faced the world as it was, without fear or illusion, while he had spent his life hiding behind his armor, his oaths. He pulled her into his arms then, the need to hold her overwhelming, as if by doing so he could shield her from the world outside. She pressed her face against his chest, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging between them. But the moment could not last. He knew that. The world beyond the walls of her cottage was waiting, and soon, it would come for her. For them both. "I will not let them take you," he whispered fiercely, his arms tightening around her. Alira pulled back, her eyes searching his, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You are a knight, Alistair. You are bound by duty. You cannot forsake that." But he could. He would. The thought of returning to the king with Alira in chains was something he could not live with. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. "I will protect you," he vowed, his voice steady, the weight of the decision settling over him like a cloak. "No matter the cost." Elira looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then, slowly, she nodded. "Then we will face this together." The hours passed swiftly as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its pale light across the fields outside Elira's cottage. Inside, the warmth of the fire offered little comfort to Alistair, whose mind raced with the gravity of what he had just promised. Elira moved about the small room, gathering her herbs and tools as if preparing for a day like any other, but the weight of their shared silence spoke louder than any words could. "We cannot stay here," Alistair finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The king's men will come. Gareth will come." Elira glanced up from her work, her blue eyes calm, though her expression was laced with sadness. "And where would we go, Alistair? Where can we run that they will not find us?" Alistair paced the small room, his hands clenched at his sides. "There must be somewhere. We could flee into the forest, take the old roads that lead beyond the king's reach." She shook her head, the hint of a smile on her lips. "The old roads are dangerous, and you know that as well as I do. Besides, running would only delay the inevitable." He stopped, his gaze fixed on her. "I won't let them take you." Elira set down the bundle of herbs she had been holding and crossed the room to him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Alistair, you cannot fight the king's will. He is not just a man. He is the crown, and the crown's reach is long." Her words were gentle, but they did little to quell the storm brewing inside him. He knew she was right. King Edric's power stretched far beyond the borders of this village, and defying him was no small matter. But Alistair had made up his mind. He had sworn to protect her, and he would. "There has to be a way," he insisted, his voice tight with determination. "If we could just buy time, give ourselves a chance to..." "To what?" Elira interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "Even if we could escape the king's men, we would be hunted. We would spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the day when they finally catch up to us. That is no life, Alistair. Not for you, not for me." He turned away, his fists clenching in frustration. She spoke the truth, but accepting it felt like surrender. He had never been one to retreat from a battle, never one to abandon a fight, but this was unlike any fight he had ever faced. How could he protect her from a force as vast and unyielding as the crown? "There is something I can do," Elira said quietly, drawing his attention. Alistair frowned, turning to face her. "What do you mean?" Elira hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor before she looked up at him again, her expression resolute. "I have ways to protect myself. To protect us." His brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in his mind. "What are you saying?" "I am not what they say I am," she said softly, "but there are truths to the rumors. My ancestors passed down knowledge that the world has long since forgotten. Healing is only a part of it." Alistair's heart quickened, his mind racing as her words sank in. He had known that Elira's skills were unlike any other healer he had ever encountered, but this was something more. His mind rebelled at the thought of her practicing anything akin to the dark arts the king so feared, but the part of him that loved her refused to see her in such a light. "You don't mean," he began, but she shook her head. "It's not what you think. I do not practice sorcery, not the way they imagine. But there are ancient ways to protect those we love, to keep them safe from harm." Alistair stared at her, torn between disbelief and the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to save her that did not involve fleeing into the unknown. But he had to know more. "What are these ways?" Elira took a deep breath, her hands falling to her sides. "It is a form of protection, a barrier of sorts, but it is not without risk. It draws on the energy of the one casting it, and the cost can be severe." Alistair felt a cold dread settle over him. "What kind of cost?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "It could take my life." "No," Alistair said immediately, shaking his head. "I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," she said gently. "Neither of us does. If we stay here, I will die by the king's hand. If I use this protection, I may die." But at least with this, we have a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless. He stared at her, his mind reeling. How had it come to this? How had they been forced into such a terrible corner, where the only option was a gamble with her life? He could not bear the thought of losing her, not like this, not because of a kingdom's fear and ignorance. Elira, there must be another way, he pleaded, his voice raw with emotion. We can fight. We can... I am not afraid to die, Alistair, she said softly, stepping closer to him. But I am afraid of you losing everything because of me. Her words struck him like a blow, and for a moment he couldn't speak. She was right. If he defied the king openly, if he fought to save her, it would cost him his knighthood, his honor, everything he had worked for. But none of that mattered to him now. All that mattered was her. I don't care about any of that, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I care about you. Elira's eyes softened, her hand reaching up to cup his cheek. And that is why I love you, Alistair. But you cannot throw your life away from me. I won't let you. He closed his eyes, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He had always been the protector, the one who fought to keep those he loved safe. But now, in this moment, he realized that there was no protection to offer her that did not come at a terrible cost. We'll face this together, he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. No matter what. Elira nodded, her gaze unwavering. Together. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows through the small windows of the cottage, Alistair and Elira sat together in silence, their hands intertwined. The choice had been made. There was no turning back now. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the village of Norhaven as the winds shifted, bringing with them the scent of rain. Alistair stood outside Elira's cottage, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. The sky above was thick with clouds, swirling in a foreboding mass that mirrored the turmoil in his heart. Every second that passed brought them closer to the inevitable. Gareth and the king's men would be arriving soon, and with them, the moment of decision. Behind him, Elira moved about the cottage, gathering the last of the herbs and materials she needed to prepare the protective barrier she had spoken of. Alistair had tried to persuade her not to go through with it, to flee instead, but she had been resolute. This was their only chance, and even though the magic would drain her, perhaps fatally, she had decided it was a risk worth taking. As much as it pained him, Alistair understood. Elira was not one to run. She had always faced the world head-on, no matter the danger. And now, he had to find the strength to do the same. But the weight of what was to come felt unbearable, the burden of knowing that she might not survive the day, no matter what he did. The sound of hooves broke through his thoughts, distant but growing closer. Alistair's heart quickened, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. He turned to see the approaching figures through the mist, Gareth and the small company of knights sent by the king. The time had come. He stepped away from the cottage, his feet heavy with dread, and moved toward the gate. The knights rode at a steady pace, their armor gleaming dully in the fading light. Gareth was at the front, his expression grim, though not unkind. Alistair had given no explanation for his decision to come ahead alone, but Gareth had trusted him. Now, as they drew closer, Alistair knew that trust was about to be shattered. Alistair, Gareth called, reining in his horse. You've spoken to her? Alistair nodded, his voice tight. I have. And? Gareth dismounted, his eyes searching Alistair's face. Is it true? Is she as dangerous as they say? Alistair took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to choose his words carefully now, but the truth was not something he could twist. She is not what they think she is. She's a healer. That is all. Gareth frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then why has the king sent us? Why all this talk of dark magic and witchcraft? The king fears what he doesn't understand, Alistair said, his voice low but firm. Elira's knowledge of healing of the old ways has been twisted into something it is not. She is no sorceress. She's saved countless lives, including mine. The other knights had dismounted now, their attention focused on the two men at the gate. Tension crackled in the air like the approaching storm, and Alistair knew that his next words would decide everything. She is not our enemy, he continued. If you bring her to the king, he will have her executed for crimes she did not commit. And I cannot allow that." Gareth's expression darkened, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Alistair, what are you saying? You would defy the king? You would betray him for this woman?" Alistair met his gaze, his heart pounding. "I would. If it means saving an innocent life, then yes, I would." The shock on Gareth's face was palpable, and for a moment, the young knight seemed lost for words. He had always admired Alistair, had followed him into battle without question. But this was a betrayal of everything they stood for, everything they had sworn to uphold. "Do you realize what you're doing?" Gareth asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You'll be branded a traitor. The king will never forgive this. You'll lose everything." Alistair felt the full weight of Gareth's words, but his resolve did not waver. He had made his choice. "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But I cannot stand by and let her die. She is not a threat, and deep down, you know that too." Gareth's gaze flickered with uncertainty, torn between his loyalty to the crown and his trust in the man who had been like a brother to him. The other knights shifted uneasily, their hands resting on their sword hilts, waiting for orders. The tension in the air was thick, like the heavy storm clouds overhead, ready to burst at any moment. "Alistair, this is madness," Gareth said, taking a step closer. "You're asking me to defy the king, to risk our lives, our honor, for a woman accused of witchcraft." "I am asking you to trust me," Alistair replied, his voice firm but not harsh. "I have never asked that of you before. But I ask it now." For a moment, there was only silence, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves around them. Gareth stood there, staring at Alistair, searching his face for something, some answer, some reason to turn back. But Alistair offered him nothing but the truth. "Please," Alistair added, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "If you've ever believed in me, in the man I am, I ask you to stand aside. Let us leave." Gareth's jaw tightened, and his hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. The other knights did the same, waiting, watching, their eyes fixed on the two men. Alistair knew that this was the moment that would decide everything, whether they would walk away in peace or whether blood would be spilled on this quiet patch of land. Gareth's hand hovered on the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a long breath and released his grip. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back. "You've always been the best of us, Alistair," he said quietly. "I don't understand this, but I won't be the one to stop you." The other knights exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them moved. Gareth's decision had sealed their fate, and none of them were willing to draw their swords against their leader's command. Relief washed over Alistair, but it was tinged with sorrow. He knew what this meant. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There would be no going back. The king would see his defiance as betrayal, and he would be hunted as a traitor. But for Elira, it was a price he was willing to pay. "Thank you," Alistair said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I will never forget this." Gareth nodded, but his expression remained conflicted, his eyes shadowed with doubt. "Go," he said, turning away. "Before I change my mind." Without another word, Alistair turned and hurried back toward the cottage. Elira was waiting for him, her face calm but expectant. She had heard everything, but there was no time to discuss what had just happened. They had to move quickly. "We need to go now," Alistair said, grabbing her hand. "There won't be another chance?" Elira nodded, but before they could take more than a few steps, the sky above them rumbled, and a sharp crack of thunder echoed through the valley. The storm had finally arrived. The wind picked up, swirling around them, and the first drops of rain began to fall. They mounted Alistair's horse and rode swiftly toward the forest, the rain beating down on them like a warning, the storm growing fiercer with every passing moment. Behind them, the village of Norhaven disappeared into the mist, and the knights watched them go, their figures fading into the darkness of the trees. Alistair could feel the weight of their eyes on his back, but he did not look back. His focus was on the road ahead, on the uncertain path that stretched before them. The forest was vast and unforgiving, but it offered the only chance they had at survival. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, no matter the danger, no matter the cost. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Alistair and Alira rode deeper into the forest, the storm chasing them like a vengeful spirit. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches and whipping leaves into the air, while the path ahead grew narrower and more treacherous with each passing moment. Alistair's grip tightened on the reins, his heart pounding in his chest, but it was not the storm that filled him with fear. It was the knowledge that they were not safe yet, not from the king, not from the danger that lurked on all sides. Alira clung to him from behind, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against his back to shield herself from the biting wind and rain. He could feel her shivering, not from the cold, but from the effort it took to maintain her focus. The protective barrier she had spoken of was not yet complete. She would need time and strength to cast it, and Alistair knew they had neither. "We'll stop soon," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "We need to find shelter." Alira's voice was barely audible over the wind. "There's a cave, further north, past the old oak tree. I've been there before. It will give us cover." Alistair nodded and urged the horse onward, his eyes scanning the trees for the landmark she had mentioned. The forest seemed endless, its towering pines stretching high into the stormy sky, and for a moment Alistair feared they might be lost in the darkness. But then, through the downpour, he spotted the gnarled shape of an ancient oak, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. "There," Alira pointed, her voice strained. Alistair turned the horse toward the tree and soon found the mouth of the cave hidden among the thick underbrush. It was small, but deep enough to shield them from the worst of the storm. He dismounted quickly, helping Alira down from the horse, and led her inside. The sound of the storm was muffled by the cave walls, and the sudden silence felt both soothing and unnerving. Alira sank to the ground, her breath shallow and her face pale. Alistair knelt beside her, concern etched in his features. "You're exhausted," he said, his voice laced with worry. "You need rest." She shook her head, though her eyes fluttered with weariness. "There's no time. I have to cast the barrier now, or we'll never make it through the night." Alistair reached for her hands, holding them in his own. "You've already done enough. We can wait until morning." But Alira's expression was resolute. "The king's men will come. They'll track us. They might already be on their way. If I don't do this now, we'll have no protection when they find us." Alistair felt the familiar ache of helplessness settle in his chest. He had faced countless enemies on the battlefield, had survived wounds that should have killed him, but now, sitting in this cave with the woman he loved, he had never felt so powerless. He could not fight this battle for her, could not wield his sword against the forces that threatened to take her from him. All he could do was watch, and hope that the price of her protection would not be her life. "All right," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm staying with you." Alira smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "You always were stubborn." He returned the smile, though it did little to ease the tension between them. Together, they prepared the space for the casting. Alira began to arrange her herbs and tools in a circle around them, her movements slow and deliberate despite her obvious fatigue. Alistair watched her carefully, his heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to do. The storm raged on outside, its fury undiminished, but inside the cave, a different kind of storm was building. Alira knelt at the center of the circle, her hands resting on the ground as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Alistair stayed close, watching as the air around them began to shift, the temperature dropping as if the cave itself was holding its breath. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," Alistair replied, his hand resting on her shoulder. The energy in the cave grew thicker, almost palpable, as Alira began to murmur words in a language Alistair did not understand. Her voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger, more forceful, as the power within her began to awaken. Alistair could feel it, an invisible force building around them, encircling them like a protective wall. The air hummed with it, the very earth beneath them trembling with the weight of her magic. But as the power grew, so too did the strain on Alira. Her body trembled, her breathing becoming labored as she fought to maintain control. Alistair watched, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that every second that passed brought her closer to the edge. "Alira," he said urgently, his voice thick with fear. "Stop. You're pushing too hard." She didn't answer. Her eyes were closed, her face pale, sweat beading on her brow. The protective barrier was nearly complete, but Alistair could see the toll it was taking on her. He moved to her side, his hands gripping her shoulders, trying to ground her, to pull her back from the brink. "Alistair, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, their gazes met. There was love there in her eyes, but also acceptance, a silent understanding that this might be the end. And then, with one final breath, she released the last of her power. The barrier snapped into place with a force that shook the ground, a shimmering wall of energy that encased them both in its protective glow. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the circle, there was only stillness, a quiet that felt like the eye of the storm. Alistair held her as she collapsed into his arms, her body limp, her breathing shallow. He cradled her against him, his heart pounding in his chest, terror gripping him as he felt her life slipping away. "Alira," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, weak but still filled with love. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Tears filled Alistair's eyes as he held her close, the weight of everything they had sacrificed crashing down on him. He had chosen her over his duty, over his king, over everything he had once believed in. And now, as she lay dying in his arms, he realized just how high the price of that choice had been. But even in his grief, he knew he would not change a thing. He had chosen love, and though it had cost him everything, it was a choice he would make again and again. As the storm began to fade outside, the barrier held strong, shimmering softly in the fading light. They were safe for now. But the future remained uncertain, and Alistair knew that they had only bought themselves a brief respite from the forces that still hunted them. He looked down at Alira, his heart breaking as her breathing grew fainter. He had saved her from the king's justice, but now he could do nothing to save her from the cost of her own sacrifice. "Rest now," he whispered, his tears falling freely. "I'm here. I'm always here." And with that, the storm outside finally broke, leaving only the quiet sound of the rain as it fell gently through the trees.